Good morning and welcome to Crack the Mic podcast with Agent of Change DeCorey Davis. And this week's segment is entitled Black Mass Incarceration. Black mass incarceration is never seen as a byproduct of systemic racism in America. But I like to argue to the contrary. In fact, for example, racism has played a major role in this very issue, dating back as early as during post-slavery, where we saw it being manifested in convict leasing, as we know it today. Now, to be clear, convict leasing can best be described as a system where state governments lease out prisoners, mostly African Americans, men, for labor, essentially allowing companies to use forced labor from convicts under harsh conditions, often considered a form of slavery by another name. Due to the exploitative nature and disproportionate targeting of Black people, this practice was legal because the 13th Amendment permits involuntary servitude as punishment for a crime. And to help me further this discussion, I have a very interesting panel that includes Dr. David Bullock, a gifted genius, therapist, professor, and social commentator who has appeared on MSNBC's The Rachel Maddow Show, The Ed Show, and is also a contributor to syndicated press like the New York Times and Russia Today. Last but certainly not least, Reverend Andre Green, lay minister for the Mount Hermon AME Church in Miami Gardens, Florida, and he's also board member for PACT, a social justice organization who has been fighting for justice in Miami-Dade County for 30 years. Good morning, gentlemen. Systemic racism can best be described as the following. Structural racism that is pervasively and deeply embedded in and throughout systems, laws, written or unwritten policies, entrenched practices, and established beliefs and attitudes that produce, condone, and perpetuate widespread unfair treatment of people of color. That is the best definition that I can provide for the listeners as it relates to systemic racism. Now, I'd like to ask the first question, if I may. What role, gentlemen, does systemic racism play in mass incarceration for so many people of color? Dr. Bullock?
Well, it's a great question. It's a very complicated question. Thanks for having me on your show this morning. I think it plays a major role in explaining and accounting for the large numbers of people of color who are incarcerated. I think there's a lot more to be said about exactly what that role is, right? And it needs to be both studied and it needs to both be addressed. But I do think systematic racism in terms of how the criminal justice system is structured, how law enforcement is trained, how the legislative system and laws are framed, right? And then how society, or let's say a particular country's society, is set up, right, to create conditions that may lead people to engage in certain behaviors. And by lead, I don't mean cause, but just create the opportunity and kind of the environment for certain behaviors and criminal opportunities to be available. All of these things are a part of systemic racism, and they do make up the larger formula, I think, right, for why we see people of color um, more represented in incarceration.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We thank you for sharing that sentiment, Dr. Bullock. You want to go ahead and share your thoughts on the question, Reverend Green?
Yes, what role does, thanks for, by the way, thanks, for inviting me. And it's good to be here. I mean, since systematic racism, what is that? Basically, it's when someone interprets the law differently for a group of people, let's say of color, than someone else. Well, the laws are the laws. It's just the way that the person who's enforcing the laws is what extreme or what excess does he go to? Does he give someone more penalties that's not of a person of color or not? I don't think that it's so much the systemicness is in the laws, which is kind of the same. I think it's the people who are implementing the laws are the ones who are committing the systemicness and the racism. And I think it's the quality of people because the laws, it's just like the sun shines in the just and the unjust. The laws are the laws. It's the way they're being interpreted towards a certain group of people than others. They're getting more time than others for the same crime and those type of things. That's the systemicness of the system, are the people who are passing the judgment down on certain groups of people. I think that we need to have a better way of measuring those individuals and rooting them out. I guess as we do with doctors and with these plans and being in networks, having a favorable outcome. If a doctor continues to see a patient and that patient is not getting any better based on certain standards, then that doctor is taken out of that network, whether it's with a major carrier or not. They're not able to do that. I think the same thing needs to be done to our system. I think there should be levels of standards where people are measured by their favorable outcomes and what they're doing, and that should be judged on the type of people they're dealing with and who's getting more charges or less. There's statistics to stating that, and there's certain people that are perpetuating this, and that will take the systemicness out of the law, and it wouldn't be so attached to what we're saying.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I like to just say, I am often amazed, quite frankly, at the fact that people aren't cognizant of the fact that Black mass incarceration is, in fact, inextricably connected to structural racism, like you alluded to, Reverend Green, because especially seeing that programs like convict leasing serves as a mean to enforce free labor at the expense of subjugating an entire group of people. But I digress. But let me just change the tides for a moment, if I may. What role, or I should say, what can be done to ensure that systemic racism is eradicated so it could help reduce Black mass incarceration, in your view, Reverend Green?
Okay, what can be done to ensure that systemic is eradicated? We can help reduce Black mass incarceration. As I stated before, I think it's the messenger, it's the person who is interpreting what the law is upon that person, and the biases that that individual has is perpetrated in their judgment. And that's been throughout history in this country, because a certain class of people feel that they're superior and they should dominate, and everyone else or don't have the intellect or the ability to comprehend the things that they do, and they feel that their ways of justice or the way that they interpret the law, that is correct. That's an alternative truth, that has been perpetuated. There is a standard, 2 + 2 is 4, 2 + 2 is not 5. but there's a certain class of people who will make you believe that 2 + 2 is 5, and they will continue to repeat it and then say something else and do something else. And there's so many wounds and cuts that nobody knows what to patch up in the system, and then it's just a mess. And nothing is done about it, and people just become passive within the system, and we have what we have today.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. Thank you for sharing that sentiment, Reverend Green. You want to go ahead and share your thoughts on the question, Dr. Bullock?
Well, I mean, I think a number of things can be done. It's a very, very complicated systems. I mean, you say systematic racism, so we're talking about racism in the system or in the systems, right? And so how do you correct a system? Well, I think Reverend Green is right. You know, we've got to get the right people in the system. So if we're talking about people who interpret laws, we've got to get the right judges. Some judges are appointed, some judges are elected. So when it comes to the ones that are elected, people need to vote for the right judges, right? When it comes to the ones that are appointed, we need to vote for the right people who will appoint judges, right?
Absolutely.
The chiefs of police typically, right, are appointed as well, right? And so you got to vote for the right mayor, vote for the right city council, you know, and then, you know, maybe fight to have democratically elected police commissioners, right? So I think there are a number of different ways to address the systems, but I think in order to address the systems, people have to be active and engaged. And so I think it really starts there.
I definitely echo that sentiment. So we're going to go ahead and take a commercial. We will be right back after this.
I realized that I could use some help with basic everyday tasks, but Hal depends on me, and I'm not going to leave him. I don't have to. Yes, that was good news, wasn't it, Hal?
Immaculate Home Health Care can give you the help you need so you can stay safely and comfortably at home from a few hours a day to round the clock. Call today for your consultation. 561-372-9108. 561-372-9108.
All right, so we want to go back to the discussion, but before I ask this next question, I'd like to kind of open up this here rabbit hole, if I may, because in order to fully understand policing, we must understand its inception origin from whence it come, or the origin from which it came. Many scholars, having said that, many scholars have often sort of ranked the origin of policing into three different categories. And I'll break them down. The first one being the frontier militia, where white settlers find themselves contesting land from indigenous persons. Or the second part, which is the slave patrol system, the South that was merely for the purpose of keeping the slaves in check. Or for the third part, which is the municipal policing part, which is regulating the class of the caste system in society. I know we don't have a caste system here in America. We call it class system, but it is definitely comparable to what they had in ancient India, the caste system. Having said that, I want to I think if we're going to fully understand how policing is inextricably related to mass incarcerations, I think we must first understand the origin of where it came from, or looking at it from I would say, a societal or a conceptualized framework of looking at the cultural, the burden that it had on the culture. For example, in other words, what I'm saying is this. If we want to look at how policing affects modern day America, we can easily look at how the cultural context that was spewed out of European thoughts, European scholars, like, for example, European philosopher Kurt Hager, he suggested that Black people don't possess the Geist, which is a German word for spirit or intellect, to and it was kind of reduced to that of a primitive nature. So if we had to ask the question, and which I'm going to ask the next question, but I'm trying to frame it around this whole ideal that perhaps the school of thought that was deeply embedded in European thought affected the way we treated African Americans. So when we have programs like Stop and Frisk, not only is it inherently evil, but it's evil because it forces the mantra that is over African Americans, painting them more as criminal or deprived individuals, thus heightening the chances for unfair arrest. So let me just ask this here next question. So, in your view, do you feel that legislative policies, Dr. Bullock, like stop and frisk, encourage law enforcement agencies to be a part of the problem versus the solution when it comes to mass incarceration? Honestly.
I mean, it's a complicated question. I think you have great questions. I think this is an important topic. I mean, do legislative policies incentivize certain kinds of negative behaviors that lead to mass incarceration in an unbalanced way? Maybe, probably, right? So I mean, stop and frisk is a very controversial police tactic. There are other police tactics like ask, tell, take, which is like a police training tactic, right? Where they ask you once, they tell you secondly, and then if you don't comply, they take you, right? So stop and frisk, ask, tell, take, when implemented by police officers in certain communities, right, could have certain negative outcomes tied to systemic racism. I think when you talk about policing and racism, you have to talk about how police officers see people, right? What do they see when they're policing in a community, right? And so some of what they see is colored through the lens of race. So I think the answer I would give is yes. I don't know. You said a lot about origins. I don't know if I agree with all of the opening statement to the question. I think we have to be very, very careful when we talk about origins, right? And like how something started versus how something ended, right? Because in a very strong way, gangs started as defensive groups in Black communities against the police, right? In fact, you had the Deacons of Defense in the South, right? Of course, we know like the Crips and the Bloods on the West Coast. Black Panther Party was kind of gang-ish, right? And so we were policing the police, right? But I don't think the Bloods and the Crips are policing the police now, right? And so how something starts, right, doesn't necessarily mean, I think, it doesn't answer the whole story about kind of how it operates now. So I would be careful about that origins argument. And I would also say we have to remember this, and I'm done. We have to remember this. Police officers are an arm of the state. The state is authorized to coerce citizens. You have to pay your taxes. You have to have a driver's license to drive a car, or you're going to get in trouble, right? You have to have a marriage license, right? I mean, this is government. This is what the state does. It tells people what to do. The police officers and the military are the violent arm of that power. We forget that.
Absolutely.
Right? And so if somebody is empowered by the state to violently compel citizens, well, then sometimes that violent compulsion is going to have negative consequences.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. And I couldn't agree with you more. And I want to play the devil's advocate for a minute, if I may, because we are a law-abiding society, or we should be. But many people, many proponents are arguing that we should defund the police because of what you alluded to, the fact that they have this quote unquote omnipotent power. And I agree that they do, because if we were to look at that institution in of itself, that institution probably by far is the only institution that does not really have anyone that they really are truly accounted to or are held accountable to. And so much in this here instance, you can take the most powerful person, let's just say our beloved President Donald J. Trump. Even if President Donald J. Trump were to pull out a gun and shoot someone, he ultimately could be convicted of a crime. However, the police, if they were to do that, they will not be convicted of a crime. And to me,
I have to disagree with you. I think we've had cases very recently where police officers were actually convicted of a crime. I mean, there are different levels, right, depending upon the burden of proof, manslaughter, homicide, murder, etc. Right, but I mean, we've seen recently, right, that police officers were convicted of a number of crimes, whether it's like bribery, right, whether it's planting drugs on folks. In fact, a number of police departments, Detroit's, for instance, for many years was under a consent decree. We have federal oversight coming in to watch the police department. And so I would fundamentally disagree with what you're saying. I think police officers are not above the law, right? I think they are empowered to use force. And so they do have the authority to use force, but that has limits, right? And part of what we need to do is we just need to make sure that they're following their rules, our rules, following the law, following the limits. But you know, what I say to folks is, I mean, if you defund the police, who you gonna call? and I say that to suggest a couple things, right? If you defund the police and you so that you can't call the police, you're still going to call somebody.
Absolutely.
Somebody's still going to use force. And so now we got the Hatfields and the McCoys, or now we got the National Guard, right? And so defunding the police doesn't really confront the problem of how should people who legitimately can use violence use it? And sometimes you need to be legitimately violent.
Absolutely.
Even God himself says what? Mm-hmm. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. God in the Old Testament was legitimately violent a whole lot of times, to the tune of drowning a whole lot of people in the book of Genesis. So I think this woke, right, politically progressive cultural shift has kind of demonized masculinity.
Absolutely.
Physical dominance, right? Aggression, violence, like, and it's trying to make people that these are not fundamental, normal aspects of human life, right? So aggression and violence, this is a part of life. So the question is, we're not trying to get rid of it. We're just trying to manage it appropriately.
Okay. Unfortunately, we are out of time for this week's segment, Black Mass Incarceration, Part 1. I want to thank my sagacious panel, Dr. David Bullock, Reverend Andre Green, but I want you to tune in on next week. We're going to continue this discussion. I want you to like and follow this YouTube channel. Again, this is your Agent of Change signing off. Peace.
I realized that I could use some help with basic everyday tasks, but Hal depends on me, and I'm not going to leave him. I don't have to. Yes, that was good news, wasn't it, Hal?
Immaculate Home Health Care can give you the help you need so you can stay safely and comfortably at home from a few hours a day to round the clock. Call today for your consultation. 561-372-9108. 561-372-9108.